No, you're not crazy. There is a lot of Mormon true crime, and today we're going to be talking about a crime that's different than a lot of the others that we talk about. See, not every Mormon true crime is crazy like the Daybells, the Frankies, the Laffertys, in an extreme Mormon connection, but that does not mean that they aren't Mormon true crimes and that there isn't a Mormon connection. So sometimes it's the most subtle connection to Mormonism that can give us some of the most important insight important conversations into the history of Mormonism and its impact on the mindset of people before they become criminals, and sometimes just crappy people. Not everybody who adopts the early fundamentalist Mormon mindset necessarily becomes a criminal, but they might just be a really crappy person. And we're going to see a lot of that in today's story. But before we jump into today's story, will you commit to like, rate, review, subscribe, or comment on your platform of choice so that Oliver Cowdery's dowsing rod can remind you to come back next week? Yeah? Okay, thank you. So when I tell these podcast episodes or when we put them in these soon-to-be upcoming blog versions of these stories, I want you to know that in those particular formats, I do my best to tell those in a way that's safe for the Mormons, verifiable for the ex-Mormons, and compelling enough for the never-Mormons. All bets are off in the comments on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, or in shorts or whatnot. But here in the long form episodes and on the blogs, I do my best to make sure that my bias does not come raging through. All right. So, yeah, that's an exciting thing that is coming for Mormon True Crime. We have a website that is coming very soon. We'll have blog. We'll have forms for you to submit cases, or if you have a case and you need to talk to me about it, we'll have a way for you to do that. We'll have a link for you to reach justice in numbers. If you have a case where you were assaulted on church property or at a church activity, you can get help with that. Or you'll have ways to support the channel there, like merch or other ways that you can help us out. So keep an eye out for that in the near future. So we're going to be talking about a serial killer that I didn't ever meet him. I want to be clear about that. But this was one of those cases where it was like, oh my goodness, like that's crazy. This serial killer was a Mormon as a kid. Isn't that wild? So I remember being a member of the church when this all went down, when this all happened. I lived in the town where this came to a head, and that completely started to like work in my mind as far as like, I wonder why that is. So I knew that he came from a Mormon family, but I wasn't sure how Mormon they were. I wasn't sure how much Mormonism would influence this case. And so I ended up discovering that it actually has some important connections to Mormonism that bring up some important conversations. And we will dive into that. But I want you guys to know that this serial killer is not Ted Bundy, but he was obsessed with Ted Bundy, the other most famous Mormon serial killer. Crazy, right? So he didn't grow up in Mormonism, and that one detail was super, super key. So we're going to be talking today about the American Predator, Israel Keyes. So Israel Keyes, he is one of the craziest serial killers of modern times. And there's 1,000 question marks that we have around this man that we may never have answers to. So Israel Keyes was the second of 10 kids. He was born in Richmond, Utah. And he was which is about 7 minutes south of the Utah border. It's about an hour drive from Bear Lake. So that gives you a little bit of context for where he was, but a teeny tiny town. In a recent census, there was like 2,700 people, and that's, years and years after he was born there. So his parents were unquestionably LDS. His dad served a mission. I believe in one of the books I listened to him, they did mention that they were married in the temple. So they were definitely a Mormon couple when they got married. Now, here's the thing is that every single book, every single episode of anything that I've listened to, they all say, for some unknown reason, his family went from being Mormon to not being Mormon. And we have no idea why. They started to just practice it by themselves at home at some point between when they got married and when Israel was really, really little, but we don't really know what happened. Well, this is that one detail that I think is super, super important. See, his family, they left Mormonism, but then they would go on to join white supremacist cults repeatedly. They're on at least their fourth white supremacist cult since they left Mormonism at this point in time today, 2024. Okay, so that's really important. So I was thinking, could it be if they are people who they quit being Mormon and they became part of white supremacist cults, what happened in those years between when Israel's parents got married and when Israel was really young? And you know what happened? 1978. Israel Keyes was born January 7th, 1978, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints ended their racial ban, making it so that Black people could finally get the ordinances that they considered to be saving ordinances in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1978. So it does not feel like a coincidence to me that we went from having this family that was in Mormonism. For some unknown reason, they left and then they go and join white supremacist cults after the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints stops practicing white supremacy the way that they were at that point in time. So anyway, I think that's an important launching point and to understand some things. So I have here my chart of the different types of Mormons. And so as we talk about this today, lots of people are going to say, oh, that's not Mormon. That's not Mormon. Blacks not having the priesthood, Blacks not having temple ordinances. That absolutely was an LDS practice at that time. Now, when the LDS church stopped doing that, that became a problem for people who still believed that that was a doctrine from God. And so they radicalized and they may have gone fundamentalist or extremist. And so I believe that that's what started to happen, is that they started to move towards being radicalized, and they ended up stepping outside of Mormonism, but I would call them radicalized extremists. So they'd be here on the outside of Mormonism, but Mormonism is where they had their core beliefs from the time that Israel's parents were born. They had these core beliefs about race and how race is something that, that the seed of Cain should never receive some of these things. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But that context to me was mind-blowing, because not only did it tell me that they were likely people who left over that, but there were likely other fundamentalist doctrines, not polygamy. Polygamy does not appear to show up with the Keys, but there are plenty of other fundamentalist doctrines, ideas, quotes, that type of thing that do show up with the Keys that they would have grown up with and it does appear to be that way, if the Keys as kids grew up in more radicalized, borderline fundamentalist LDS homes. So that being said, Bruce R. McConkie gave a devotional August 18th, so about 10 weeks after the ban took place or ended. Bruce R. McConkie, who was a general authority in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, gave a devotional called All Are Alike Unto God. And he basically talks about the fact that people are confused, like, quote,
"There are statements in our literature by the early brethren which we have interpreted to mean that the Negroes would not receive the priesthood in mortality. I have said the same things, and people will write me letters and say, 'You said such and such. How is it now that we do such and such?' And all I can say is that It is a time disbelieving people repented and got in line and believed a living modern prophet. Forget everything that I have said or what Brigham Young or President George Buchanan or whomsoever has said in days past that is contrary to the present revelation. We spoke with a limited understanding and without the light and knowledge that now has come into the world. We get our truth and our light line upon line and precept upon precept. We have now had added a new flood of intelligence and light on this particular subject. And it erases all the darkness and all the views and all the thoughts of the past. They don't matter anymore. It doesn't make a particle of difference what anybody ever said about the Negro matter before the first day of June of this year, 1978. It is a new day and a new arrangement, and the Lord has now given the revelation that sheds light out into the world on this subject. As to any slivers of light or any particles of darkness of the past, we forget about them. We now do what Meridian Israel did when the Lord said the gospel should go to the Gentiles. We forget all the statements that limited the gospel of the house of Israel, and we start going to the Gentiles.
But long story short, yeah, like there was a huge falling out. So there were plenty of people who at various points in time, when something significant changes policy or theology wise with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, lots of people suddenly leave. And so this is one of those cases. And I believe until Heidi Keys tells me otherwise, I believe that that's what they left over. I believe that that's why they were no longer practicing members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So, we need to get into some of the theology around race that Heidi and her husband, John, would have been really attached to. And so we're going to just read some of these quotes about race that would have made it so that they were like, no, this is that you're no longer speaking from God because this is absolute. This is what God taught up until now. If you're teaching differently, then you are a fallen prophet. So, quote, "Shall I tell you the law of God in regard to the African race? If the white man who belongs to the chosen seed mixes his blood with the seed of Cain, the penalty under the law of God is death on the spot. This will always be so." Close quote. Brigham Young, March 8th, 1863, Journal of Discourses, 10:110. Quote, "The seed of Ham, which is the seed of Cain descending through Ham, will, according to the curse put upon him, serve his brethren and be a servant of servants to his fellow creatures until God removes the curse, and no power can hinder it." Discourses of Brigham Young, page 279, Journal of Discourses. Okay, and seed of Ham, which is the seed of Cain, the mark of Cain is something that you're going to see in other quotes is talked about as being black skin, okay? Quote, "Surely no one of you who is an heir to a body of more favored lineage would knowingly intermarry with a race that would condemn your posterity to penalties that have been placed upon the seed of Cain by the judgments of God." Close quote. Harold B. Lee, Decisions for Successful Living. So he was a prophet until just, I believe, is 1973. So this is the prophet when my parents were growing up. He's saying this. And Israel Keys, this was the prophet when Israel Keys' parents were teenagers as well. And so that's who they were listening to, right? Okay. This is from Moses 7:22. Which is a Mormon scripture, and Enoch. So Enoch is, the city of Enoch was translated. So they were made perfect, and they were, a lot of them were taken to heaven because they were so perfect. And they were a Zion community. Okay. So, and Enoch also beheld the residue of the people, which were the sons of Adam. And they were a mixture of all of the seed of Adam, save it was the seed of Cain. For the seed of Cain were black, and had not place among them. Okay, so if this is in your scriptures, it makes it really hard for you to be like, oh no, see, it's not, no, that's not what God said. It's literally in like your leather bound set. The descendants of Ham, besides a black skin, which has ever been a curse that has followed an apostle of the holy priesthood, as well as black heart, have been the servants to both Shem and Japheth. And the abolitionists are trying to make void the curse of God. So abolitionists are trying to make void the curse of God. That's super key. Because this is a 1863, right? So context, make void the curse of God, but it will require more power than man possesses to counteract the decrees of eternal wisdom. So he's saying there that this curse of people being black, being beneath white people, cannot be reversed. Okay. So that's Brigham Young, March 8th, 1863. President Joseph Smith. So you can't just say that this was, this just happened to be Brigham Young. President Joseph Smith Jr., January 2nd, 1845. He said, and I quote, "Had I anything to do with the Negro, I would confine them by strict law to their own species." Close quote. And then this is the official statement of the first presidency to BYU, President Ernest L. Wilkinson, dated August 17th, 1951. It says, open quote, "The position of the church regarding the Negro may be understood when another doctrine of the church is kept in mind, namely the conduct of spirits in the premortal existence has some determining effect upon the conditions and circumstances under which these spirits take on mortality. Under this principle, there is no injustice whatsoever involved in this deprivation as to the holding of the priesthood by the Negroes." So this is saying that because of the premortal existence, that black people have earned not having the priesthood. Okay. So black people being allowed to have the priesthood, black people being allowed to have temple ordinances, you can see that this isn't just like one or two isolated quotes. I had many, many more, but I didn't want to spend, 45 minutes just reading these quotes. It's super important to understand what a big deal this would have been to some people. And people like the Keys are people that this would have been a huge, huge deal to. Additionally, it's important to know that the Keys family, they were extremely anti-government, like militant level anti-government, which you're like, oh my goodness, like the Articles of Faith say that, we'll obey, honor, and sustain the laws of the land, right? It says that. But there's also a whole lot of other context that's super important here. So the Mormon pioneers back in the 1800s, anytime they started to have problems with the law, they would move. They would move somewhere else. And they would go from Kirtland. They ended up in Nauvoo that way. They left Nauvoo that way. They ended up in Utah that way. So problems with the government and with laws making it so that they couldn't practice their religion, AKA they couldn't practice polygamy. They couldn't practice having 30 some odd year old men marrying teenagers. Those were huge issues for the people around them. And so the law would go after them and then they'd leave. They weren't being persecuted for believing in the Book of Mormon. They were being persecuted for believing that it was okay to practice polygamy and coerce women into these relationships. Okay. So understanding that Mormonism has this history of moving constantly when the government becomes a problem for you. Also, there was like the Utah War. So there was literally a war between the Mormons and the government, and finally Utah conceded and put out the manifesto saying that they were going to stop practicing polygamy, and then they did not for another 15 years, I want to say. So the existence of Utah at all is evidence that Mormons didn't want to be part of the government, and so they literally left the country to go formed their new place because they wanted to practice it their own way, not the way that the government allowed. They, like I said, lied about polygamy from 1890 to 1905. We also have stories from the Book of Mormon that are pretty anti-government, and it's your duty to fight against the government if they're putting undue pressure or undue stress on your faith, okay? So we have Lehi's family, which the Book of Mormon literally starts with. It's a family that's in Jerusalem. They don't like how things are going down in Jerusalem. Supposedly Jerusalem's about to be destroyed, and so they flee. So then we also have the title of liberty, where Captain Moroni, he ends up not being happy with the way that the government in the Americas is going, according to the Book of Mormon. And so then he puts a title of liberty, rips a piece of cloth, his jacket, I believe, and he hangs it on a pole and, rides into war with it. And it says, in memory of our God, our religion, our wives, our freedom, these types of things. And so then we also have the story of Korihor. The story of Korihor. Korihor and another man, they were infiltrating the government with people who agreed with what they wanted. And so then people fought back against this evil, wicked, corrupt government. We've seen this more recently with the Bundys. So there's the family, the Bundys, that they've had standoffs with law enforcement to protect their property coming from these ideas. We also have seen tons of, the avenging angels, the Danites, the early days where people were willing to go to extreme lengths to fight against the government. Governor Boggs allegedly was shot, not shot at, but shot, and he survived it by Porter Rockwell, who was searching for a gun close to where Governor Boggs was shot not too far after that. So you can see that even if you don't personally believe that the historic Mormon Church was anti-government, you can see where there are lots of these stories that would make it so that somebody like the Keys would be like, no, this is what God wants. This is what we're supposed to do based on how they grew up. Also, I did not know that this was part of historic Mormonism. So this was a journey, and wow. So I learned that the Keys family, they were incredibly anti-medicine. They wanted to use herbal medicine for everything. They wanted to just do everything as naturally as possible. So I was like, wait a second, could there be something from historic Mormonism that would explain why they had this mindset? Because we can see that they already have fundamentalist ideas and fundamentalist beliefs. Apart from polygamy, they are fundamentalists, right? So I was like, could there be something from fundamentalist Mormonism that would explain this? And there is. So there was this claim back in the 1800s that the doctors that the government had supplied for the Mormon Battalion were trying to poison and take out the members of the Mormon Battalion. So it ended up being this thing. It was a whole thing, right? So I'm going to just read you these quotes. Quote, "Doctors and their medicines I regard as a deadly bane to any community. I am not very partial to doctors. I can see no use for them unless it is to raise grain or to go to mechanical work." Brigham Young. Quote, "If you are sick, live by faith and let surgeons' medicine alone if you want to live, using only such herbs and mild food as are at your disposal." Brigham Young. Okay, so we can see that they had some beliefs that still were in line with Brigham Young. And so I have no doubt that they were reading this too. And I also came across this gem of a poem, and it's by Levi Hancock, who I learned was a general authority for like 50 years. He died in the 80s, so he would have had in the 1880s. So he died in the 1880s. So he would have had, if it was 50 years, he would have had to have been like a general authority under Joseph Smith too. So Anyway, it says, a doctor which the government has furnished proves a punishment. At his rude call of Jim along Joe, the sick and halt to him must go. Both night and morn this call is heard, our indignation then is stirred, and we sincerely wish in hell his arsenic and calomel. So I was like, wait a second. Okay, I can see them being upset about being provided arsenic. However, I ended up learning that at this time, it was very common for arsenic. They thought that arsenic was the medicine, right? So these doctors weren't like consciously choosing to give just the Mormons the arsenic. See, arsenic was used for treating asthma. It was used for treating cancer. It was used for a low libido. It was used for skin issues, right? So arsenic was used as medicine at this point in time, not just like as a poison. And so somebody could say that this just shows that like the prophets were in tune and they knew that it was poison even if the doctors didn't. So there you go. Enjoy that. Now that we've created this context, do you understand what kind of people the Keys were? The Keys were the kind of people who they were all about all of that. So that was the mindset of the people who raised Israel Keys. I don't have proof until Heidi Keys sits down with me and says, yeah, that's why we left. I don't have proof that that's why they left. But the timeline works and the context makes it make sense in my mind. The church changed their position on those things. The Keys figured the church is fallen, the prophet is fallen, they're in apostasy. They're going to go find a new way to practice. So that brings us to 1983. And Israel was 5 years old. His family moved to Washington and they joined the Ark. The Ark is a part of the Christian identity movement. The Christian identity movement began in the 80s and it's a group who they call themselves Christians and they are all about white supremacy. They are anti-Semitic. They are anti-government to a militant degree. They are not people that you really want to run into. So that movement begins in the 1980s and they get involved in that movement. They join the Ark and they would also attend a different Christian identity movement. That church claims that Israel Keys only attended a few times, as well as Chevy Kehoe. So I'll tell you about that in just a minute, but it's super fascinating and gives context to how militant and anti-government and antisocial the Keys family was. And I mean that not just an antisocial, I'm antisocial, like I just want to be left alone sometimes, right? No, we're talking like anti-social, like the whole world, anti-humans. Okay. So the second church that I mentioned that the Kehoes and Keys that they both went to, they say that the FBI has said that they're the only non-militant Christian identity movement church in the U.S. You decide if you think that that was true or not. They also were like, oh, they barely came here, right? So anyway, they end up taking this to a whole different level, right? So they were kind of living somewhat a fundamentalist life before, but they ended up moving to Washington and they go off grid. Their dad begins building a cabin, and this cabin has no water. It has no power. They end up living in a tent for years while he's building this cabin. They finally get the cabin built, but they're very no medicine. They're very anti-government and they are in white supremacist cults. The end, right? And so Israel, he had some like tension with his family. He would end up building his own cabin off in the woods and living there for a period of time. But they are next level right-wing radicals. In Israel's teenage years, he was homeschooled. He was friends with the Kehoes. So he was friends with Chevy and Shane Kehoe. Now, the Kehoe brothers, they ended up having a shootout with the police, and the police pulled them over. They refused to present ID, and so the police were going to arrest one of them. They bring him back to his car. He tries to run away. The other brother starts shooting at the police. The other brother does get away, and then they ended up having another shootout where there were 30 rounds fired. A passerby got shot in the shoulder. None of the Kehoes or the police were injured in that shootout, though. So the crazy thing, though, was that they were pulled over and this whole thing went down because they had a whole lot of weapons. See, they had stolen weapons from a family, the Mueller family. The Mueller family had gone missing. The Mueller family goes missing and they ended up finding their bodies at the bottom of a lake. And it was the mom, the dad, and the 7-year-old little girl. They had suffocated them before and then they disposed of the bodies in the lake. These are the kind of people that Israel Keyes was growing up with. Okay. Chevy also claimed that he was part of the Oklahoma City bombing, and there was a owner of a hotel or a motel that Chevy had stayed at a few months before the Oklahoma City bombing, who said that Chevy was indeed at his hotel with his friend Tim. And Chevy was involved in that type of thing. We don't know whether he actually did that or whether he was taking credit for something else to try and make himself more prolific. But Chevy and Shane, Israel, these guys came from the same area, the same cults. So anyway, Chevy and Israel, they would go burgle homes and they would take guns from those homes and then they would sell those to gun shops and at gun shows and that type of thing. They ended up doing things, Israel didn't tell us very much. He was very elusive. We do know that he would hurt animals in the woods. He did it in front of other kids when he was 14 and the other kids were like, "What are you doing, man?" And that was the first time he realized that not everybody wants to do this. Not everybody just wants to hurt people and hurt things, hurt animals like that. So he just started to do it alone, but he was still committing crimes with the Kehoes in this period of time. In his late teen years, his family left those two white supremacist cults in Washington and they became Amish and they moved to northern Maine. So they're in northern Maine and they end up becoming full-blown Amish. And Israel Keyes is like, you know what, guys, actually, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in any of this. And they were devastated and all but cut him off. They ended up being equally upset or even more upset when he decided to join the Army Rangers and be involved in the government, right? This is a government entity. They're anti-government. And he's going to go join the Army Rangers. So he's in the Army Rangers for about 3 years, 1998 to 2001. However, in 1997, right before they left to go to Maine and become Amish, there was a girl who went missing in Colville, which was the town they lived in Washington. And she went missing. We have no evidence that she actually was one of Israel's victims. She could be a Kehoe victim. We don't know. But Julie Harris, she was a double amputee. And so she was found with both of her prosthetic legs near her after she had been assaulted and killed. And her body was found near a river in the town where he lived. There was another girl that went missing. Again, we have no proof whether Israel was the one who did this or not. We can clearly see there were plenty of people in the area who were sketch. All right. So we don't have proof whether Julie was actually a victim or not. However, he does tell us about how at this point he went down to a river in 1997, 1998, right before he joins the military. And he did abduct a girl and sexually assault her, but she was just way too friendly. He said he might have killed her, but he didn't. He decided not to because she just kept asking him 1,000 questions and it was irritating because she wasn't afraid. He wanted somebody that was going to be super afraid and she wasn't. So he confessed to his first victim before he joined the military. So his family goes to Maine. He goes with them. He has a fiance that he goes back and forth between seeing her and not seeing her. And she's Amish and he ends up meeting somebody who he has really great chemistry with and he falls in love with. Her name's Tammy. Tammy was half black is half black, half Native American. And he ended up falling in love with her and they ended up having a baby together. So they had their daughter. She's referred to as Sarah, but that's not really her real name. Her name, she's protected in all of this as she should be because she hasn't done anything wrong. So Tammy and Israel have their daughter and they ended up getting divorced. Tammy struggled with addiction. So she struggles with addiction. She's arrested and Israel Keyes gets custody of their daughter and he ends up leaving Tammy And he gets with his girlfriend, Kimberly, and he ends up in Alaska. So he's living in Alaska. And I was living in Alaska in the same town as Israel Keys when this all went down. I lived in Anchorage, Alaska, and this was in 2012. So February 1st, 2012, I was on vacation at this point. I just have to tell you guys that. So I ended up coming back into town, and I come back in and I just see that there are missing posters absolutely everywhere. And we'll talk about those here in a minute. But that was my experience. Was I came in after this all went down. So Israel, he ended up going to go get coffee at the Common Grounds coffee stand on Tudor Road in Anchorage, Alaska, February 1st, 2012, late at night. And these coffee shacks, they're everywhere, all over Anchorage. These coffee shacks are run primarily by a barista, or they were at this point. It's kind of changed since this happened. So Samantha Koenig was the one working the Common Grounds coffee stand that night. And she has a customer. She prepares his coffee. She turns around to go give him his coffee, and there's a gun in her face. She jumps back. She ends up going over to the cash register to get all of the cash out of it for him. Then she ends up standing for several minutes with her hands up, talking with this man. And this was something that threw the police off. They were like, oh, she has to have known that. Like, who would sit there and talk with somebody that long? But that's what happened. Eventually, she gets on the ground. He jumps into the coffee stand. He grabbed a bunch of napkins and shoved them in her mouth so that she couldn't yell. And he took zip ties and zip tied her wrists together. And he told her that she needed to pretend that she was drunk and that she better not try and run or get attention or get help. And so she did end up trying to run, but she ended up falling, and he got her and dragged her back to his truck. And at this point, he transported her to his shed. She said, like, I don't have any money. I don't have anything. And so he said, well, I need your ATM card. She said, well, my ATM card is in my boyfriend's truck, and, I don't have it on me. So he transported her to his home, put her in a shed, turned the heater up in there, turned the music on really loud so that nobody could hear her, and told his girlfriend and daughter that he'd be working in the shed, just leave him alone, right? And so he ends up blasting that music. He goes to go get her ATM card. He tests it to make sure that it works. It does. And then he came back and he raped her and he killed her in a very brutal way. Very, very sad. Then he took her body and shoved it into some cabinets in his shed, and he went and packed up to go on a cruise. So the very next morning, he was leaving extremely early for a cruise. He planned this because nobody would ever believe that he had abducted her when he was leaving for a cruise at like 4 a.m. the next morning, right? And so he did that and left her body. It was, February in Alaska, left her body in there. And so it was super cold. So decomp wasn't, the issue that it might have been in a warm month. So he goes to Texas before he goes on this cruise, and his family is in Texas. And so he visits his family after the cruise is over. And February 13th. So Samantha goes missing February 1st. Everybody in Alaska is freaking out, and we're all looking for her there, right? February 13th, he's in Texas. And he tells his family that, he got stuck in the mud, and he's missing basically for a few days while he's in Texas. While he's in Texas, in the area that he's in Texas, a man named Jimmy Tidwell also went missing. And there was the next day, so February 15th, Jimmy goes missing. February 16th, there's a bank robbery in the town where Jimmy went missing, and another bank robbery in a very close by town. And on the footage of the bank robbery, there's a man about Israel's height who's wearing a construction hard hat, and he has long curly hair coming out from under that. That would be a really morbid thing, because when we ended up actually learning about this from Israel, the FBI asks him, well, like, where did you get the wig? And he said it wasn't a wig. And they asked him, like, well, but where'd the hair come from? And he said, hair's free. That's the kind of human we're talking about, guys. So 2 weeks apart, he abducts and allegedly takes the life of Jimmy, but we know he took Samantha's life for sure. And I just don't see how we would think that he didn't take Jimmy's life with that context. So February 18th, he returns to Alaska, where he would dismember Samantha. He would take her out to Matanuska Lake, and he used a chainsaw to cut a hole in the ice. He put up an ice fishing shack so that he could discreetly dispose of her body down through the hole that he cut in the ice. During this whole period of time, he begins to text Samantha's boyfriend and her dad. He demands $30,000 in ransom by putting a note underneath a sign. So, some little pictures here for you guys. I meant to put these up for you. Samantha in the video of her in the coffee stand. And these are the signs that were up all over Anchorage when I came back from my trip and when Israel came back from his. So they get a text and it says, Connor Park, sign under pic of Albert, ain't she purty? And there was a picture of Samantha Koenig under that. So he had taken this picture of Samantha with a recent newspaper while he was gone so that it could never be tied back to him. He ends up demanding this ransom, and they would only give him $5,000. So they only put $5,000 on because they wanted him to have to reach back out. So he goes to the lower 48, goes from Las Vegas through Arizona, New Mexico, and ends up in Texas. But along the way, he stops and he gets cash out from ATMs along the way, and he makes some mistakes along the way. And police are able to identify his rental car as a white Ford Focus. And this white Ford Focus, it ends up being the thing that police officer is like, okay, there's a white Ford Focus, and we think that this guy might be the guy. So they pull him over for going 2 miles over the speed limit. And then he has an Alaska driver's license. So they end up being like, oh, we got to be sure. They ended up eventually going through his vehicle, discovering that he had Samantha's debit card and other things that connected him to Samantha. So the FBI had put out that BOLO, and a police officer in Texas did capture him. He was then arrested, and they said, we want to know where Samantha is. And he ends up telling them, like, hey guys, you don't even know. I'm so much more than just Samantha. And he confesses in this that he is a serial killer, that he's been obsessed with Ted Bundy, and that he is absolutely a serial killer. And he wants them to have to work for it to figure out who are the people that he's taken their lives of. He ended up saying that he wanted the death penalty. So he wants the death penalty. So I'll give you enough that you'll give me the death penalty, and I want it quickly. And I don't want this to get out to the media because I don't want my daughter to have to deal with the repercussions of my actions. So he would dangle info. He would just give a little bit and then pull back, a little bit and pull back. And he ended up telling them that he would travel to places where years prior he had buried kill kits in Home Depot buckets. So he put lots of tools inside these buckets to make it so that he'd have the tools to go back years later and commit these crimes. And he ended up confessing to doing that to people like the couriers who he abducted from their home. He took them to an abandoned home. He tied up Lorraine, and then Bill, he went to go tie up and assault Bill, but Bill fought back and he wanted to get to his wife. He was fighting to get to his wife to protect her. And Israel ended up shooting him. Lorraine, he would assault her brutally before he took her life. We've had him connected to Deborah Feldman as well. So he would assault men, women. He assaulted anybody. So there was nobody was safe. It was just whoever was available. So he would actually tell detectives that he had less than a dozen victims, and they said that they knew that most people count in 5s or 10s. So the fact that he was saying less than a dozen told them that it was probably 11. And so Samantha, they eventually got him to confess, and he told them she was in Matanuska Lake. Divers went and recovered her body. Her funeral was held by some people who were actually in my ward in Alaska. They owned a funeral home, the Novakoviches. Anyway, they ended up finding Samantha, and on December 1st, 2012, so 8 months after Samantha was recovered, Israel Keyes took his life in his jail cell. He wasn't supposed to be given razors, but he was, and he used one to slit his wrist, and he used his other hand to hang himself. But before he did that, he would make these paintings out of his own blood. There are 11 skulls, and there's a painting that says, "We are one." And so the belief is that these are his 11 victims, and that this was his confession. The problem is he would fly to random locations, which we have countless accounts of him flying places, and then he would rent a car and use cash to drive hundreds of miles from where he flew into. So it could be anything, anywhere. And the only thing we really have to go on is, was there a bank robbery within a few hundred miles of where Israel keys landed when people went missing? And so we don't know who most of those 11 people would be. So this, like I said, this is not our normal Mormon true crime where Keyes and his victims were Mormon. But the question is, did the programming of fundamentalist teachings of Mormonism in Israel's parents create a lifestyle that fed his antisocial psychopathy? Did living off the grid, being anti-medicine, being a white supremacist, anti-government, due to the history of Mormonism, result in him becoming a prolific serial killer? Thank you guys so much for coming and listening to today's episode. But before you go, will you commit to like, rate, review, subscribe, or comment on your favorite platform of choice so that Oliver Cowdery's dowsing rods can remind you to come back next week for another Mormon True Crime?